Hello, my name is Francis Lévesque. I'm a professor at the Université du Québec en Abitibi-Témiscamingue at the First Nations building campus de Val d'Or. I'm really honored to be reading you parts of the TRC report, and hopefully this will help keep this report in the public, in the minds of the public, and in the minds of our politicians. So I'm reading about the history, the Industrial Schools Initiative from pages 58 to 61. It was in keeping with this intent to assimilate Aboriginal peoples and, in the process, to eliminate its government-to-government relationship with First Nations that the federal government dramatically increased its involvement in residential schooling in the 1880s. In December 1878, J.S. Dennis, the Deputy Minister of the Department of the Interior, prepared a memorandum for Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald on the country's Aboriginal policy. Dennis advised Macdonald that the long-term goal should be to instruct our Indians and half-breed populations in farming, raising cattle, and the mechanical trades, rendering them self-sufficient. This would pave the way, and I open the quote, for their emancipation from tribal government and for their final absorption into the general community. Dennis argued that residential schools were key to fulfilling these goals. It was his opinion that in a short time, schools might become self-sustaining institutions. In the following year, Nicholas Davin, a fellow conservative candidate, carried out a brief study of the boarding schools that the United States government had established for Native Americans. He recommended that Canada establish a series of such schools on the prairies. Davin acknowledged that a central element of the education provided at these schools would be directed towards the destruction of Aboriginal spirituality. Since all civilizations were based on religion, it would be inexcusable, he thought, to do away with Aboriginal faith without supplying a better one. For this reason, he recommended that while the government should fund the schools, the churches should operate them. The decision to continue to rely on the churches to administer the schools on a day-to-day basis had serious consequences. The government constantly struggled and failed to exert control over the churches' drive to increase the number of schools they operated. At various times, each denomination involved in school operation established boarding schools without government support or approval, and then lobbied later for per capita funding. When the churches concluded, quite legitimately, that the per capita grant they received was too low, they sought other types of increases in school funding. Building on their network of missions in the Northwest, the Catholics quickly came to dominate the field, usually operating twice as many schools as did the Protestant denominations. Among the Protestant churches, the Anglicans were predominant, establishing and maintaining more residential schools than the Methodists or the Presbyterians. The United Churches, created by a union of Methodist and Presbyterian congregations, took over most of the Methodist and Presbyterian schools in the mid-1920s. Presbyterian congregations that did not participate in the union established by Presbyterian Church in Canada and retained responsibility for 2 residential schools. In addition to these national denominations, a local Baptist mission ran a residence for Aboriginal students in Whitehorse in the 1940s and 1950s, and a Mennonite ministry operated 3 schools in northwestern Ontario in the 1970s and 1980s. Each faith, in its turn, claimed government discrimination against it. Competition for converts meant that churches sought to establish schools in the same locations as their rivals, leading to internal divisions within communities and expensive duplications of services. The model of these residential schools for Aboriginal children, both in Canada and the United States, did not come from the private boarding schools to which members of the economic elites in Britain and Canada sent their children. Instead, the model came from the reformatories and industrial schools that were being constructed in Europe and North America for the children of the urban poor. The British Parliament adopted the Reformatory School Act in 1854 and the Industrial School Act in 1857. By 1882, over 17,000 children were in Britain's industrial schools. Under Ontario's 1880 Act for the Protection and Reformation of Neglected Children, a judge could send children under the age of 14 to an industrial schools where they might be required to stay until they turn 18. Such schools could be dangerous and violent places. At the Halifax Boys Industrial School, first offenders were strapped and repeat offenders were placed in cells on a bread and water ration. From there, they might be sent to the penitentiary. The Canadian government also drew inspiration from the United States. There, the first in a series of large-scale government-operated boarding schools for Native Americans opened in 1879 in a former Army barracks in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. On the basis of Davin's report and developments in the United States, the federal government decided to open 3 industrial schools. The first one opened in Battleford, in what is now Saskatchewan, in 1883. It was placed under the administration of an Anglican minister. The following year, 2 more industrial schools opened, one at Qu'Appelle in what is now Saskatchewan, and one in High River in what is now Alberta. Both of these schools were administered by principals nominated by the Roman Catholic Oblate Order. The federal government not only built these schools, but it also assumed all the cost of operating them. Recruiting students for these schools was difficult. According to the Indian Affairs Annual Report, in 1884, there were only 27 students in the 3 schools. Unlike the church-run boarding schools, which provided a limited education with a heavy emphasis on religious instruction, the industrial schools were intended to prepare First Nations people for integration into Canadian society by teaching them basic trades, particularly farming. Generally, industrial schools were larger than boarding schools, were located in urban areas, and, although church-managed, usually required federal approval prior to construction. The boarding schools were smaller institutions, were located on or near reserves, and provided a more limited education. The differences between the industrial schools and the boarding schools eroded over time. By the 1920s, the federal government ceased to make any distinction between them, referring to them simply as residential schools. In justifying the investments in industrial schools to Parliament in 1883, Public Works Minister Hector Langevin argued that, and I open this quote, "If you wish to educate these children, you must separate them from their parents during the time that they are being educated. If you leave them in the family, they may know how to read and write, but they still remain savages, whereas by separating them into the way we propose, they acquire the habits and tastes, it is hoped only the good taste, of civilized people." End of quote. The federal government entered into residential schooling at a time when it was colonizing Aboriginal lands in Western Canada. It recognized that, through the treaties it had made commitments to provide Aboriginal people with relief in periods of economic distress. It also feared that as traditional Aboriginal economic pursuits were marginalized or eliminated by settlers, the government might be called upon to provide increased relief. In this context, the federal government chose to invest in residential schooling for a number of reasons. First, it would provide Aboriginal people with skills that would allow them to participate in the coming market-based economy. Second, it would further their political assimilation. It was hoped that students who were educated in residential schools would give up their status and not return to their reserve communities and families. Third, the schools were seen as engines of cultural and spiritual changes. Savages were to emerge as Christian white men. There was also a national security element to the schools. Indian Affairs officials Ansel McRae observed that it is unlikely that any tribe or tribes would give trouble of a serious nature to the government whose members had children completely under government control. End of quote. Duncan Campbell Scott succinctly summarized Indian Affairs goals for the schools in 1909. Open the quote, "It includes not only a scholastic education, but instruction in the means of gaining a livelihood from the soil or as a member of an industrial or mercantile community, and the substitution of Christian ideals of conduct and morals for Aboriginal concepts of both." End of quote. The achievement of such invasive and ambitious goals would require a substantial level of funding. This was never forthcoming. And so I'm done, and thanks for listening.